So why don't we talk first about sort of how you came to do what you're doing right now, and then we'll talk about how your political views were formed over time, because they do seem to move and evolve over time in a way that's really unique in the space. So first, I think that, to talk about, kind of how you came to prominence in this space in the first place. My first experience seeing some of your stuff was during the Occupy Wall Street protests, when you were the only person who was out there actually taking footage and covering that stuff. But how did you get started in this area?
Well, it started with Occupy Wall Street. So I had been doing nonprofit work. I've been hanging out with hackers, and this was back in like the days of Anonymous and some other hacker groups. And so the big core ideology behind what we did and why we did it, and it was mostly other people, I wasn't super active, was making sure people had access to information, be it get them the internet or give them the key details as to what's going on. And then all of a sudden you had these journalists say, well, that's journalism. You're sharing information. You're disseminating that stuff. So for me, I ended up on the East Coast. And then when I saw Occupy Wall Street happened, I was just I had just left California. I'm just some guy who's skateboarding and making videos. And I decided to go and start filming, eventually start live streaming. And while I'm streaming, I'm giving my thoughts on what's happening and essentially doing this raw live commentary. I had this big moment where I did a live stream for 22 hours straight. People were like running up to find me to give me batteries to keep it going. And then I started just covering conflict and crisis. From there, I went from some guy who's live streaming these protests to actually working for Vice. And I was the founding member of Vice News, the actual vertical, where I went on the ground to various countries, like Venezuela, like Turkey, Brazil, went to Egypt, watched the revolution happen. And I was just covering the conflict and crisis stuff there. Eventually, the conflict and crisis came to the US. So I ended up working for a company called Fusion. They started out trying to be like Vice. And this was at a time, this is 2014, when these companies all started getting super woke. I've never been particularly interested in, the weird cultural far left stuff. Even though I saw it at Occupy Wall Street, I was like, I think that's kind of ridiculous. So I ended up working with this company, but within 7 or 8 months, they got a new editor-in-chief. All of a sudden, everything they're doing is woke. So they essentially put me in, what we call golden handcuffs. I was paid really well to work for this, Disney company, but they didn't want to use real, on the ground conflict reporting because they wanted to do video segments about, woke stuff, I guess. But ultimately, my contract ended. I started doing my own YouTube channel, and I started by actually traveling around. So I went to Sweden. I did a 2-week daily vlog from Sweden, interviewing people, seeing what was going on. This was when Donald Trump did that. There was that famous moment where he said, "Last night in Sweden, you see what happened," and the media went nuts. That was a crazy moment for me because all of a sudden I had my colleagues from Vice who used to help me go to these countries messaging me saying, "Don't go to Sweden to cover the story." And I was confused. Why wouldn't I? I went to Egypt. I went to Ukraine. I went to a bunch of countries. No, but don't do this one. Trump's lying. And I'm like, I don't know anything about this. I don't know anything about Trump or what he's talking about. I just heard there are some claims about, refugees and crime. I'm going to go and investigate it. And they got really, really mad at me. And that was when I could see this weird split starting to emerge. So from there, I come back to the US and I started covering the conflicts we see on the ground in the US, Proud Boys, Antifa, that kind of stuff. And of course, what do I see? 99% of the time, you get some Trump supporters waving little American flags and Antifa shows up and attacks them. I would report it. Antifa would get really mad at me. So they started threatening me, doxing me. Someone posted a photo of my mom at one point. And so that was for me, I think I already had some, personal biases going back to my upbringing in Chicago. But now it's all I'm trying to do is cover what's happening on the ground. And by telling the truth, these extremists and Antifa type people were attacking me and threatening me. And that, was kind of, I guess, to be expected. But it did set me off on a path where, for one, I couldn't actually go on the ground anymore. So I slowly stopped doing it because it was getting more and more dangerous. So then I started doing more and more news commentary and analysis to kind of make up for the fact that I couldn't be on the ground, aggregate more of the people who actually are doing the work. And I kind of feel like it's not a completely uncommon track for journalists to go from field reporter and then eventually later in their career, they find themselves as a news commentary kind of person. And then once it just became completely obvious that, it happened when I went to Portland. I had some guy chasing me around yelling while I'm trying to film. And I'm like, okay, clearly I got, too many people know who I am. They're seeking me out. They're causing trouble. They're trolling, or they're actually attacking me. So I'm going to have to stop coming to a lot of these events and then just report to the best of my abilities from the desk. I just started increasing the amount of work I started doing. I started doing multiple segments per day. Now I think I do an hour and 45 minutes of direct commentary, and I do a total of I do an additional 2 hours of a live podcast show, which brings me to this position where now I'm kind of this, I think, as you mentioned, like a heterodox individual, don't really fit necessarily anywhere. Although I think I've been classified as like cultural right wing, whatever that means. But my political positions are kind of just like where Democrats used to be. It's a weird position to be in. I will say, I think the easiest way to explain that I'm not orthodox, I suppose, in some capacity, like I'm a heterodox personality, is whenever they try and smear people who are, like right now, you got a lot of people on podcasts and YouTube, for instance, that are saying the election's not over. You get these articles saying, or CNN, for instance, you've got the right-wing media lying, claiming the election's not over, but they never mention me. Because if they do, they show you like, my segments are actually fairly, I don't want to say bland, but the joke is that I'm a milquetoast fence sitter. I will tell you, we have a sworn affidavit from numerous, poll watchers, but I'm not going to come out and scream the election was stolen and Trump won. I'm just going to say we should investigate this. It doesn't really work very well for the mainstream media to smear me as some kind of conspiracy theorist when I don't make an assertion beyond here's a fact. So ultimately, I find myself in this weird position where, for one, if you go to like my flagship channel with the most subscribers, it's like basically the media is trash and the Democrats are too. So then people see that and they say Tim Pool must be right wing. But then when it comes to actual policy, like my politics are probably, independent center left, and I disagree with conservatives on a lot of core issues that result in Trump supporters getting mad at me. It's a weird position. I don't know. But ultimately, that's where I'm at now. And then I guess at some point, Ben Shapiro hit me up and asked me to come on his show. So, yeah.
So I want to talk with you about, you obviously were covering Antifa. You've covered in detail Black Lives Matter, and you mentioned sort of the woke phenomenon. I want to talk about the phenomenon, and then I want to talk about what I think is actually a more important issue, which is the meta phenomenon of how social media and the media refuse to cover this phenomenon, how they have decided that certain narratives are worth cultivating and certain narratives must be barred, certain narratives must be suppressed, because to me, that is the scarier the scarier phenomenon, is sort of the mainstream deciding what we can and cannot see. There's the radicals, and they're scary, but they're kind of a small proportion of the population. Then you actually have like this mainstream phenomenon of attempting to quash any discussion of the radicalism, which effectively makes them enablers. So let's talk about Antifa. So you covered Antifa on the ground. We've been told by the media that Antifa are alternatively World War II era Allied troops storming the beaches of Normandy. We've been told by Joe Biden that they are not, in fact, a group, that they are, in fact, just sort of a philosophy, sort of like Cubism or something, like an artistic movement. Well, what exactly is Antifa, since you've covered them on the ground?
It's it's not necessarily wrong to say that they're a movement or an idea, but it's the individual cells that we're talking about, I think what you're talking about. And what they do is the mainstream media uses a semantic argument to try and act like they don't exist. So to put it simply, Antifa is the symbols they use, the ideology. Typically, you'll find many of these people are authoritarian communists. And I'm not trying to exaggerate or do some stupid, they're all communists. No, like they're literally, they believe in authoritarian communism. But it's rooted in, pre-World War II Germany, Weimar Germany, where you had the Communist Party had their anti-fasciste action, and it was challenging the fascists. They use the same symbols. They create small individual groups with, they say no leaders. They have leaders, they do. And then they coordinate for various actions. They call them nationwide. So ultimately what you have are political zealots who believe in the use of violence for political gain and terror for political gain. What they'll do is they'll tell you, and they'll have allies in media tell you, there's no such thing as Antifa. It's not a group. Well, that's a semantic manipulation. They're playing a game here. If I say Antifa came out in Portland and attacked people, I'm talking about Rose City Antifa. It's a legitimate group. They have membership. They have membership drives. They put out, flyers or they put out a website saying, here's how you join our group. They have their own merchandise that says Rose City Antifa on it. So it would be like, the media is trying to use wordplay to trick you into believing that these various groups don't exist. Because if I said, I went to Portland and Antifa came out. Then I went to Boston and Antifa came out. They say, aha, see, that proves it, because there's no connection between those two groups. But it's the general idea is they hold that same ideology, wearing all black. They use similar tactics. They use the same symbols, and they typically agree with each other on their cause and their means to the end. So you actually have a loose-knit group of various cells that coordinate with each other, using violence against their political opponents, for the most part, instigating it outright to win. And it works for them. The example I often give to people, why is it that social media is so willing to censor right-wing individuals, but Antifa is literally organizing violent riots online, even probably right now? They've been doing it, all year and for the past several years. And it's simple. Antifa in, say, San Francisco, in the Bay Area, they'll show up to the headquarters of these big tech companies and they'll trash the place. So these companies say, well, leave them alone. But there's not going to be a conservative group marching to Twitter HQ with pitchforks and torches. So long as big companies keep giving Antifa what they want or showing them their tactics work, they'll keep doing what they do. As for the loose-knit nature of what they do, it's all on purpose. The reason why they don't have an official nationwide organization is it's actually really easy to understand when you look at the Proud Boys. Obviously, the Proud Boys and Antifa are not the same things, but there are similarities in that you have these groups that fight on the ground. The Proud Boys have a chairman, Enrique Tarrio. Well, they've banned him from dozens of banks. They've banned him from all these different platforms. You give someone a leader, they use that to actually try and discredit the rest of your group. Antifa knows this. I've actually talked to people going back to Occupy Wall Street who have straight up said, no leaders. As soon as you put someone up, they'll smear, they'll character assassinate. So it is on purpose they say they don't have leaders. However, law enforcement knows who the individual cell leaders are, I would imagine. And I think some of them got doxxed recently. So it's really, it's not, their tactics aren't perfect, but I will say the left is much, much better at street level organizing than the right. And so you end up with a media narrative that can't understand what Antifa is or outright defends them on purpose. I think there's two things. You've got the activist media that hates Donald Trump, and they're saying, Antifa's no big deal, but they're saying it because they want to protect Antifa. You then have these local reporters, these people who are probably, they have good intentions. They're trying to be objective and fair, but they can't grasp the concept of Antifa as a group because Antifa has specifically obfuscated what they really are. So you can't report on what they are. Then you get someone like, say, Andy No or Elijah Schaffer, someone like at one point what I was doing, and we can accurately break it down and report on the ground. They get really angry about that. And we all saw what happened to Andy No, when he was out there in Portland, and they physically beat him. They left him bleeding and covered in, milkshake and stuff like that. Those are the people they're really worried about. But long story short, they're radical far left. They typically are authoritarian communists, but not all of them. Some of them might just be, they might be like left anarchists. I know there's a big debate over whether or not anarchists can actually be left or right, but they view themselves that way. They'll view themselves as socialists. But the big issue I see with Antifa is that you might find someone who will try and lie and justify, no, we don't believe in violence, it's self-defense. But these are the narratives they like to use to get away with what they do. And so long as you have these mainstream resistance type Democrats who hate Trump, they won't call these groups out. And that's been something I've experienced going back to Occupy Wall Street, where the peaceful, legitimate protesters are told by these groups to respect their, quote, diversity of tactics. It's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. The idea that you're going to engage in some kind of strategy against a big system, but diversify what that strategy is makes no sense. You want to have a cohesive plan as to how you're going to make change happen. The reality is these groups say respect our diversity of tactics because that's code for getting violent and hurting people. And then you get these good-natured protesters who just want to, wave their little signs and banners and be heard, now standing back as Antifa messes with people, knocks them down, starts fires. So I will say, I think Antifa, for the most part, is a colloquial term we use to describe the far left extremists who use what's called the black bloc tactic, where, they wear hoodies, they wear masks. I don't know what we'll call them in the future. We just called them the black bloc anarchists, 10 years ago. Now they're Antifa. They're still here. They're still rioting. Apparently, the media calling it for Joe Biden did nothing to change their minds. And in fact, I think it's only likely to escalate if we do enter a Joe Biden administration, because certainly Joe Biden won't be strong enough to deal with these groups that are pressuring him and attacking him and getting violent. And we already saw this. I believe recently they attacked a DNC headquarters saying F Joe Biden. So anyway, there you go. I think I ranted too much on what Antifa is, but we can, follow up.
I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special. If you did, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you stay up to date on all of our future content.